Welcome back. We're going to continue with colonial society here with Section 3, Slavery, Anti-Slavery in the Atlantic Exchange. Slavery was a transatlantic institution, but it really developed a distinct characteristic in British North America. By 1750, slavery was legal in every single North American colony. But local economic imperatives, demographic trends, and cultural practice all contributed to the very distinct colonial variants of slavery. Virginia was the oldest of the English mainland colonies. It imported its slaves in 1619. They were really brought to their shores more than they didn't place an order or anything. But Virginia planters really built larger and larger estates and guaranteed that these estates would remain intact through the use of primogeniture, in which a family's estate would basically descend to the eldest male heir, and the entail, a legal procedure that prevented the breakup and sale of estates. So the distribution of property, which kept wealth and property consolidated and guaranteed that the planters would dominate social and economic life in the Chesapeake. This system also fostered an economy dominated by tobacco. By 1750, there's approximately 100,000 African slaves in Virginia, at least 40% of the colony's total population. Most of these slaves worked on large estates under the gang system of labor, working from dusk to dawn in groups with close supervision by white overseers or slave drivers who would use physical force to compel labor. Virginians used the law to protect the interests of slaveholders, actually. In 1705, the House of Burgesses passed its first comprehensive slave code. Earlier laws had already guaranteed that children of enslaved women would be born into slavery. Conversion of Christianity would not lead to freedom, and owners could not free their slaves unless they transported them out of the colony. So you couldn't even let your slaves free. Slave owners could not be convicted of murder for killing a slave. Conversely, any black Virginian who struck a white colonist would be severely whipped. Virginia planters used the law to maximize the profitability of their slaves and closely regulated every aspect of their daily lives. In South Carolina and Georgia, slavery was also central to colonial life, but specific local conditions created a very different system. Georgia was founded by the philanthropist James Oglethorpe, and you might want to remember this and write it down for quiz and test purposes, that James Oglethorpe originally banned slavery from the colony, but by 1750, slavery was legal throughout the entire region, in every single colony in the Americas. South Carolina had been a slave colony from its founding, and by 1750 was the only mainland colony with the majority of their population being African population. The fundamental constitutions of the Carolinas, co-authored, believe it or not, by the philosopher John Locke in 1669, explicitly legalized slavery from the beginning. So yeah, John Locke, the whole, philosopher behind our Constitution and Bill of Rights, yeah, that guy, yeah, he wrote it into the Constitution of Carolina that slavery was legal. Many early settlers in Carolina were slavers from the British Caribbean islands, and they brought their brutal slave codes with them. Defiant slaves could be legally be beaten, branded, mutilated, castrated. In 1740, a new law stated that killing a rebellious slave was not even a crime, and even the murder of a slave was treated as a minor misdemeanor. South Carolina also banned the freeing of slaves unless the freed slave left the colony. Now, despite this very brutal regime, the number of factors contributed to South Carolina slaves actually living more independent in their daily lives. And so kind of also remember this, that, and kind of write this down. The rice was actually the staple crop, right, that underpinned the early Carolina economy. It was very widely cultivated in West Africa. The planters commonly requested that merchants sell them slaves that were skilled in this complex practice of rice cultivation. And slaves from Senegambia were particularly prized. Okay, the expertise of these slaves contributed to one of the most lucrative economies in the colonies. The swampy conditions of the rice plantations basically fostered really dangerous diseases, though. And malaria and other tropical diseases spread and caused many owners to live away from their plantations. And we've talked about this before. It wasn't explicitly in Chapter 3, but we kind of mentioned this in class, that these elites who owned the plantations lived like far off. And so these West Africans were, they had a higher level of immunity to, say, like malaria due to some genetic trait that, would give them a sickle cell, which would lower their chance of catching malaria. It reinforced planters' radical belief that Africans were particularly suited for labor in tropical environments, which is messed up. It is very much worth mentioning once again, and writing this down for this week's quiz and for the unit test, that with plantation owners far from home, Carolina slaves end up in what's known as the task system. And under that system, slaves were given a number of specific tasks to complete in a single day. Now, once those tasks were complete, slaves had time to grow their own crops on, plots allotted by their plantation owners. Thriving underground markets allowed slaves a degree of, kind of economic autonomy. But the Carolina slaves also had unparalleled degree of cultural autonomy. This autonomy, really coupled with frequent arrival of new slaves, enabled the slave culture to retain many African practices. Syncretic languages like Gullah and Geechee contained many borrowed African terms, and traditional African basket weaving combined with Native American techniques survive in that region even to this day. Okay, and so it's very much worth noting that. And here's the slide that kind of says it. So you can pause that. I forgot to flip the slide, but you can pause that, but we're going to move on to the next one. This unique low country slave culture contributed to the Stono Rebellion in September of 1739, when on a Sunday morning, planters are attending church. A group of about 80 slaves set out for Spanish Florida under the banner that reads Liberty. They burned plantation. They killed like 20 white settlers as they marched. They headed for Fort Mose, which was a free black settlement on the Georgia-Florida border. So they're emboldened by this Spanish Empire's offer to freedom for any English slaves that escape. Well, the local militia gets together. They defeat the rebels in combat. They capture and execute most of the slaves, and the others they sell to sugar plantations in the West Indies in the Caribbean. Though the rebellion was ultimately unsuccessful, it was a violent reminder that slaves were not just going to lay down. They would fight for their freedom. Slavery was also an important institution in the mid-Atlantic colonies like New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. While they never developed plantation economies, the slaves were employed on larger farms growing cereal grains. Enslaved Africans worked alongside European tenant farmers on New York's Hudson Valley in what was known as patroonships, which were huge tracts of land were granted to, some early Dutch families, and the slaves were able to also a common kind of site in Philadelphia and New York City and other ports where they worked in the maritime trade and domestic service. I would suggest that you understand that by 1700 and 1750, basically, New York's economy was so reliant on slavery that 40% of its population was enslaved by 1700. And while 15 to 20% of Pennsylvania's colonial population was enslaved by 1750, those two were very, very, very large numbers for two colonies that, well, at least Pennsylvania for sure, that was not this big, giant, like, plantation system. So it's worth noting those two kind of numbers, 40% in New York and 15 to 20% in Pennsylvania. In New York, the highest density of slaves and a particularly diverse European population increased the threat of rebellion. You have a slave rebellion in 1712, resulted in the deaths of 9 white colonists. In retribution, 21 slaves were executed, 6 others committed suicide before they could be burned alive. In 1741, authorities uncover another planned rebellion by African slaves and free blacks and poor whites. Panic unleashed a witch hunt that only stopped after 32 slaves and free blacks and 5 poor whites were executed. Another 70 slaves were deported, likely to the sugarcane fields of the West Indies. Now, there was groups that were uneasy about this, and you need to know always, for quiz and test purposes throughout this entire unit, Quakers did not believe in slavery. Quakers were the first to turn against slavery. Their beliefs in radical nonviolence and fundamental equality of all human souls made slavery really hard to justify for them. Most commentators argued that slavery originated in war, where captives were enslaved rather than executed. And to pacifist Quakers, the very foundation of slavery was illegitimate. Furthermore, their belief in the equality of souls challenged the very racial basis of slavery. And by 1758, Quakers in Pennsylvania disowned members who engaged in the slave trade. And by 1772, slave-owning Quakers could be expelled from church. These local activities in Pennsylvania had very broad implications as to the decision to ban slavery and slave trading, and that debate within the Quaker meetings throughout the English-speaking world. The free black population in Philadelphia and other northern cities also continually agitated against slavery. And so slavery as a system of labor never really takes off in Massachusetts, Connecticut, or New Hampshire, though it was legal throughout the region. The absence of cash crops like tobacco or rice really minimized the economic use of slavery. In Massachusetts, only about 2% of the population was enslaved as late as the 1760s. A few slaves in the colony were concentrated in Boston, along with a sizable free black community that made up about 10% of the city's population. While slavery itself never really took root in New England, the slave trade was a central element to the region's economy, because every major port in the region participated to some extent in the transatlantic trade. Newport, Rhode Island, alone, had about 150 ships active in the slave trade by 1740, and New England also provided foodstuff and manufactured goods to the West Indies plantations. So definitely had ties there as well. All right, and that brings us to the end of this section about North American slavery.